Hello, I'm George Liston, CA. Welcome to Dialogue, a program that explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. International development is a field whose scope ranges from the intensely intellectual to the acutely personal. In a very real sense, development occurs one person at a time. As someone whose own introduction to international affairs came through the Peace Corps, I've long admired those whose task it is to translate theory into practice and seek improvement in the affairs of nations at the grassroots level. My guest is Alan Cavalier, whose international development experience spans more than 30 countries over the course of a quarter century. Alan, welcome to Dialogue.
Thank you, George.
It's great to have you here, and it's an absolutely fascinating career, which continues, of course, as you continue to devote yourself to these activities. I'm curious, Alan, as we start with how it started, because I know you were trained as a research chemist and began with that profession, but how did you shift into the international arena?
Like most things, it wasn't planned. I moved from chemistry into education. I trained at school level, at intermediate, and then polytechnic and university level. And then I went into management, and then the natural sequence to that was to try and put this into practice on international projects.
Right. I mentioned at the outset, Alan, this rather impressive array of countries, which spans the globe literally. What about some of the agencies and employers you've done this for? That I didn't mention. I mean, who have you carried out these activities on behalf of?
It's very varied. You have international organizations, and then you have governments of particular countries, and then you have NGOs, non-government organizations. They are very strong in that field as well. And then you have private companies. Private companies do sometimes invest in international projects, and it's for mutual benefit.
And you've worked for some in each category.
Yes.
And for example, the United Nations, for example? Or?
No. No.
ASEAN?
Yes.
Name some of the bigger ones that you've dealt with.
World Bank, Asian Development Bank, British Council. The NGO I worked for in Bangladesh was BRAC, which is extremely good. And then I've done some things for international multinationals who've also taken on the development role.
Right. I mean, that in itself I find extremely impressive, because you have literally covered the field of all the types of agencies involved in this work. Another thing, Alan, about your career that stands out from your resume and your writings is that so much of it has dealt with what I would call individual development, that it really has been a focus on training of the talent pool in the various countries you have worked in. I want you first to tell me if that is correct. If so, why that's important, and further, what are the key elements in doing that? What makes it work?
You're absolutely right. Sometimes it is individuals. Sometimes it's very small groups. You might get a university group who want to develop a particular training program, so they need assistance with that. You base it on their needs, their work. You don't superimpose, but it needs usually the assistance of somebody who's had perhaps a bit more experience. We can also work with small groups. So if it's a train the trainers group, then we would tend to do that with only 8 people. If you have a larger group than that, you can't give them specific attention.
Right.
Sometimes their needs are very different. When we're dealing with groups from different countries, we will often work to a top figure of about 32.
Right.
And that certainly is big enough.
You know, I appreciate every part of that answer, but one thing really stood out for me. You said, and I think I did get this right, it's very important to work with their experiences, their beliefs, and I guess by extending that, their cultures. How important is cultural sensitivity? I mean, are you the person coming in saying, this is how we're going to do this, or do you have to take into account how they have done whatever's been done there for ages?
Certainly we don't go in and say, this is how you should do it. That would be the biggest mistake ever. Every country is different, every culture is different. You have to be objective, look at it, discuss with them what they need, and what you deliver is what they need. You are not coming from outside saying, this is how you should do it.
And how important, when you say looking at how they did it, do you look back in sort of a millennial or historical sense? This is their culture. These are the things they prize. These are the values they have, and we must be sensitive to that. Is that part of the ethos?
It is, yes. You look at the status quo, and sometimes you can't make big changes, but you can make improvements. And sometimes it's better that they continue doing what they have always been doing, but in perhaps a more modern approach or a wider practical approach. But you just make fine adjustments.
Right, and is always respectful of who they are.
Absolutely.
You know, one of the tactics, if I may use that word, that I think you have employed, at least I've seen it in things you've written, fascinated me, and that is the use of storytelling as a technique for getting things across. I mean, I just found the phrase, really, as I say, quite interesting, but what does it mean? How do you do that?
I think it's applicable at all levels. I mean, when you're dealing with children, you deal with stories. This is what they enjoy, and they can relate to it. But it's carried over to the adult. So when you give a presentation, the best thing to do is to make it realistic by telling a story. And if you can relate it to that particular culture, then they go along with it.
Seems to me the corollary of that would be listening.
Absolutely. Yes.
That you really have to be attentive to what they have to say.
Yes, you have to be a good talker at times, but also an extremely good listener. Because if you don't listen, you're going to miss the point. You
know, I don't want to sound as though I'm here simply to flatter you, but it seems to me that you're a person who genuinely likes dealing with other cultures and doesn't have a sense of estrangement at all about dealing with them. Would you characterize yourself that way?
Yeah, I wouldn't be doing the job unless I enjoyed that. I mean, I think it would show. So I have to listen and observe and take part and feel that while I'm in that particular country, that's what I'm doing. It's their culture, and I'm not there to bend it in a particular direction. I'm trying to raise the point. That's really the meaning of the word educate.
Have you yourself been educated in this process? Has it changed you?
Most certainly, yes, yes. Whether I'm a better person for it or not, it's not for me to say, but I feel better for it.
In the larger sense, Alan, in terms of this array of projects and organizations for which you've worked, this question may be too complex for a simple answer, but I'd love anything you'd care to say about it. And that is, if we took consultancy programs as a general topic, what would be some of the principles you would say are important to the best of them? What makes one work as opposed to those that don't work? I mean, what's essential? What makes a good consultancy into the development field?
I think the best consultancies are those with very clear objectives, which are agreed on both sides, and certainly where the outcomes are measurable. So if you can do something which is very practical, and you can see people at the end of the day or week or 2 weeks being much more skillful, competent, and able to do something that they couldn't do before the course, then that is measurable. And therefore you feel good about it, and so do they.
And what makes that happen? Is that because the design was undertaken collaboratively with the people you're dealing with, or they had input into it? I mean, what makes that process work?
Well, that obviously is central to the starting of a project, but what you need is to select consultants and trainers who are very practical. People do not want to sit and listen all the time. They want to do things so that when you go away, then they can remember and learn and develop what you have helped them produce.
And is it one of those, and I'm fascinated with that, you sort of, it strikes me as doing it by example to the greatest extent possible, taking people into the field, giving them real tasks. Is that right?
That's right.
That's the technique?
Yes.
Give us an example.
Well, you could take, for example, a coffee plantation in Tanzania, and what you would do would be to find the oldest, the most experienced person on the whole estate, and then you would say, you'd flatter them. You would say, "You're extremely good at what you do. So would you be my practical agent, if you like? I may do the talking." Because I will talk to you beforehand and get you through it. So you don't have to worry about confidence in speaking, But what you have to be able to do is demonstrate a particular skill. And I would tell the group, this man is the expert. He can do the skill. I'm putting it into words, but you watch him. And therefore you get that feeling that here we've got the expert and we're going to learn from him.
I'm really glad I asked that question. I mean, I think I and people watching understand in a nutshell your technique here, which really is to put the people there first and bring forth their talents.
Absolutely.
And that has worked. And I guess by contrast, when things don't work, it's because people try to impose too much.
Absolutely. How do you know what Tanzania needs from Europe?
Well said. Well said. How do these things get funded? I guess that's a pretty complex issue as well.
Yes, I mean there's a more and more need for that these days because, as you know, the world is getting a harder place to live in, and people have got to be sustainable, and therefore they need these sort of programs where they can develop. So you hope for funds from governments, but where governments can't afford it, there will be overseas agents, there will be international development organizations, and more there will be companies that will actually put funds in because they see a mutual benefit. They gain from it, but also the country gains from it.
Right. That phrase that you just used really stuck out for me. The world's getting to be a harder place to live. And you're referring, I take it, to the populations you have dealt with largely. And I'm going to use that as a jumping off point, if you will, Ellen, for something I've wanted to do for years. So you're not the first person to come on this show and talk about development, but I think you are the first to talk about it in a grassroots way. I want to test some of the things that I think I've gained from past guests against your experience and see your comments on them. We were privileged to have early in Dialogue's history former President Joaquim Chissano of Mozambique as a guest. I was thoroughly impressed with this man. And he made some interesting points, and let me get your take on them, and we'll talk about other people as well. One of the things he said, and it goes to your harder place to live notion, is that globalization, in terms of its effect on third world and third world development, is not the boon we in the West may think it is. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, to a point. Globalization is going to happen. So let's accept that fact anyway. It will go ahead. But the role of the government in a country is to make sure that it can match that. So if we took the case of a fast food store arriving in another country, then in a way they should be welcomed with open arms. It's something different. I happened to see a fast food store open in Tbilisi in Georgia. And I was actually there when it happened. And the queues were enormous. It was just staggering. And I thought, do they know what they're getting? But that's what the young people wanted. Whereas I knew that if you went down the side streets in a small restaurant, you could get local food, local produce, cooked locally, local wine, and that was really good. So you had hopes in the future that they develop that side of the industry, and eventually these people who were swarming towards the fast food stores can say, hey, we can do as well as this. This is even tastier than what they serve.
You know what you make me feel right now is hungry for Georgian food.
Go for it.
Yeah, I will. I mean, it'd be great if they could export it here. That's a fascinating take on the globalization issue right there. Thank you. In the same vein, we had another African president here. I think he is currently still in office, Museveni of Uganda. And of course, you know, Alan, that country has made quite impressive advances in how they've dealt with the AIDS issue. I think they're one of the African continent's most stellar examples. But people in the wake of that program did comment, and I think they had a point I'll pick up with you, that while AIDS is an extraordinarily important issue for our times, we cannot forget that the health problems of Africa go far beyond that, and there may be a need for a resurgence of attention to less dramatic ills. So your sense of that? You've worked in a lot of African countries.
Yes, I think that's true. It goes beyond that because at a much more basic level, if you have problems with water in a country, then the AIDS situation is going to get worse. So, for example, the infant mortality in northern Nigeria is incredibly high. If a child lives beyond the age of 5, that is remarkable.
That's terrible.
Absolutely, and that can be resolved with water because most of the diseases that these poor children suffer from are waterborne. So if you you can provide good fresh water from wells and improve the sanitation, then half the battle is won.
Nigeria is one of the countries you spent a lot of time in. Is that connection accepted by the authorities you've dealt with, and beyond the authorities with the aid specialists nationally? I mean, is that kind of relationship between good water and good health patent?
Well, I think for example, the Water Aid Organization in Nigeria are very well aware of the fact that health is correlated with good water. The exact figures, of course, are difficult to produce, but there is no doubt about it. Where you get good water, you get better health.
You mentioned in the earlier part of our conversation, my instigation perhaps, the importance of cultural sensitivity in planning programs. And of course that, I would assume that is also important in carrying them out. And I had a guest, actually a young scholar who appeared on our program some years ago by the name of Jesse Ribaud. He was a creative artist as well as a scholar of development. And he raised another dimension of the cultural sensitivity issue in development. And that is the need to be culturally sensitive in terms of sustainable development. And his example, Ellen, was developing a lumber trade in Senegal, with which he had experience, that could both profit the country by expanding the business, but also preserve the forestry and national traditions as well. Do you subscribe to that notion?
Oh, absolutely, yes. I think if I refer to your own case, you couldn't have been as effective in Brazil unless you understood the language and the culture. And only on longer jobs can you really take on the language problem. On a lot of occasions, you just don't have the time.
Right.
But if you are somewhat of a master of that language, that makes the whole job a lot easier. And
that language gives you insight into the history, the culture. You can't learn the language without, in effect, learning these other things.
You pick that up as you go.
Right.
Yes.
Jesse Ribaud was a relatively, as I say, young person, and perhaps not that well known, although he certainly will be. A very well known person who came here and spoke with me in terms of the development question is Jeffrey Sachs, who's a world renowned expert on these issues and largely focuses on health. And he made an observation that sticks with me, Alan, and I want to get your take on it, and that is that when people talk about health in developing countries, we think of AIDS, we think of very complex issues, but we really should think of things like basic sanitation. That if you, and this goes back to your connection comment of a moment ago, that if you could achieve basic sanitation improvements in a lot of countries, that would be a major health benefit right there.
Absolutely. I mean, if you consider a village in a remote African area, then if you could do two things, if you could first of all produce good water and sanitation and drainage, and then secondly electricity, that will make a tremendous difference without any training program. But of course the other amazing thing is that in countries like Africa they have made a huge technological jump because of the mobile phone.
Explain that. That's interesting.
Well, in the past, the people who were the producers of food were, particularly in the developing countries, were in the hands of the people who had major power further away, and so they could actually pay as little as possible to those poor people who were actually producing in the field.
That's right.
But the mobile phone gives the opportunity for the person in the field to contact people higher up the chain, and so you cut out the middlemen. So it sounds strange, but the mobile phone has helped the poor farmers to develop more.
You know, that's absolutely fascinating to me. Just by being able to communicate, having greater knowledge, you can bring greater leverage on the system you might not otherwise have had.
The in phrase for that is leapfrog technology. So you'll find in a lot of the Western world there will be telephone wires in the street, and the people from developing countries come along and say, "What are those up there?" And you say, "Well, those are wires that carry electrical messages." "Oh, we don't have those. We have mobiles."
We're far beyond that.
Yes.
That's priceless. You know, I mentioned people whose names are associated with development, but I want to bring into this section of our conversation someone who's not associated with development, who I spoke to. Because James McGregor Burns, he's a major American historian, perhaps certainly one of the best we have in this country. And he's written a lot about leadership. Mm. And so that's my opportunity to ask you, Alan, because you obviously dealt with not just the populations, but also with leaders, and you've seen them in action. Mm. And maybe the most colorful way to phrase the question is, who, in your experience, Africa or elsewhere, has impressed you as an exemplar of national leadership in this development field? Who would you cite?
That's a difficult question. There are many leaders who you could cite in this particular case, but a leader of one of the NGOs who I've worked for was outstanding. Mm-hmm. And you could say that he was, not only was he the mastermind behold of this, but he also took an active part in it. Mm-hmm. So you found yourself being greeted by him mm-hmm. In the middle of nowhere, and where he was responsible for over 65,000 people. Mm. And they were the people who put the development programs into practice.
Right. What about national leadership? He is impressive, but for example, Tanzania is a country you spent a lot of time in, and President Nyerere, I think you had experience with.
Yeah, he was an outstanding man, and you can actually measure the changes that have taken place. So you've got very good training, and you've got systems being developed, but also you have got many more women in key positions in Tanzania through their development programs than you have in a lot of others. Mm. So I think Julius Nyerere has a lot to be credited with.
That's excellent. And I particularly like that comment about women, because I really think bringing women into positions of responsibility is a core development need everywhere. I can't let this conversation conclude without bringing forth this book that you and Jeff Wilkinson, your colleague, have written. Mm. And it's actually a collection of humorous anecdotes that drawn from your experiences, and it's well worth reading just to get the lighter side of what you've come to know in all of these years. Tell us a bit about the book, a sentence or two, but also mainly what it's for, what you wanted to accomplish.
Good question. It's for entertainment. We're in a field where there's a lot of serious academic people who've written works about this, and do we need another one? Our feeling was that in spite of all of this hard work, and these programs are hard work, and we tend to give 150% to try and make sure they do work, and that is very enjoyable. But there's also a funny side, and we make that funny side aware to the people who are participants on our course. We are not afraid to be laughed at when things go wrong, and we admit things go wrong. And if you look at the book, you'll see that most of the stories derive humour in the situations that we're in. Mm-hmm. And if you can't do that, you might as well go home.
I was struck by that as I read the stories myself, and it's not humour at the expense of people, though.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Humour expended at our expense.
And this brings up another point, because we talked about you and, before we get off this book, though, there's another issue here to be talked about. The book is clearly for sale. And it's been selling, I think, very well in the UK. And what's it going to? I mean, what happens with the proceeds?
It's in the book. It goes to two main charities. So proceeds go to cancer research, which I feel very strongly about. Jeff's collects money as well from the sale of the book, and his money goes towards a conservation project in Tanzania, which I have had a slight amount of work with, and it is quite outstanding in what they have brought about. So it's gone beyond the fields of conservation, but he has managed to bring in churches, hospitals, schools, people going across from Tanzania to Britain and vice versa. It is very measurable.
I like that. I like that. I like the idea of this book. As we conclude our conversation, Alan Cavalier, I'm mindful of another, not a book, but I think a video that I saw that involved you once. The title of it was very intriguing, and it really gives me a jumping off point for the last question of our conversation. You described your work as, and here I quote, the best job in the world. Few men would sit before me and say that, but since you have, what do you mean by that?
I think it's luck, but I'm doing a job which I enjoy, which I've been perhaps trained for. Some people get some pleasure from it, and I can safely say that each project I renew and my interest in it, and how many people can say that they enjoy really what they do? I think they are few and far between. So
I think I'm in the presence of one of them right now, and your enjoyment's contagious.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir.
George.
And that's our program. We appreciate your comments, and you can reach us at dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. I'm George Liston, CA, and you've been watching Dialogue, a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHC Networks. Dialogue is also on the MHC Worldview channel, which is available to public TV stations nationwide. For more information, go to www.mhcworldview.org. Please join us again right here next week, and thank you for watching this week. Alan Cavalier, magnificent man. I am very happy.
Next week on Dialogue.
But it seems to me that at the very core of everything, we have a fact of history. The Ribbentrop-Molotov non-aggression pact just before World War II. So gentlemen, I'd like to introduce our audience and ourselves to this conversation by showing a clip from that film and asking our first question. So let's look at it.
The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, signed in Moscow on the 23rd of August 1939, was a non-aggression treaty devised by Soviet Foreign Minister Molotov and Nazi Foreign Minister von Ribbentrop. But it also included a secret protocol. Under the terms of the pact, Stalin could occupy the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, and declare war on Finland. In return, Hitler was to have a free hand in Poland. A week later, on the 1st of September 1939, the German Wehrmacht invaded Poland and the Second World War began.